So, hello, good morning, everybody. It is a great honor and pleasure to welcome you here. I am Barbara. I am part of the board of the Italian Geographic Society. And again, I welcome you here also on behalf of the president and all the other members of the board and people working here in Italian Geographic Society. The aim of this board is to try to make this institution not only an invaluable archive of the memory of Italian geographic, but also continue promoting geographic knowledge, hosting lectures, seminars, and initiatives that connect us with today's most pressing challenges. And so we are deeply honored to have Katherine here today. And I want to thank you, Cesare, for organizing, first of all, her visiting professorship here in Rome at the Memotef Department of Sapienza, and then for the idea of doing this public lecture, so to somehow share this important event of having Katherine here in Rome with a public lecture here for everybody. So I will leave the word to Cesare to better introduce Katherine, and thank you again, and welcome, Katherine.
Thanks a million, Barbara. Thanks a million to the society for hosting us today. I think it's so important that we open, academic spaces to, everyone. And so, for me, it was such kind of actually perfect choice to be here today. And thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks to Katherine for accepting our invitation. And as Barbara mentioned, thanks to Sapienza that made this possible because Katherine's visiting is funded by the university. And so really thanks to our university. I'm really, really honored to have here with us Katherine Gibson, one of the most influential thinkers for personally my intellectual growth, but I guess for so many critical geographers all around the world who have found in the work of Gibson Graham a source of inspiration and drive to pursue research endeavors that challenge conventions and are committed to social transformation and social justice. Emeritus Professor Katherine Gibson, Western Sydney University, Australia, is internationally known for her research on rethinking economies as sites of ethical action. She trained as a human geographer with expertise in political economy, and with her collaborator for over 30 years, the late Professor Julie Graham, developed a distinctive approach to economic geography drawing on feminism, post-structuralism, and action research. The Diverse Economies Research Program they initiated has become a vibrant subfield of study within the social sciences. In the late 90s, the collective authorial voice of J.K. Gibson Graham led the critique of capitalocentric thinking that was blocking the emergence of economic possibility. The End of Capitalism, as we knew it, a feminist critique of political economy published in 1996, was republished in 2006 with a new introduction and named a classic in human geography by the leading journal Progress in Human Geography in 2011. Gibson Graham's work on a post-capitalist economic politics has had a widespread readership among those interested in economic alternatives. It has been translated into Chinese, South Korean, Turkish, Spanish, French, and now Italian, but I will get to that in a second. And prior to joining Western Sydney University in 2009, Emeritus Professor Gibson held position as professor and head of the Department of Human Geography in the Research School of Pacific and Asian Studies at the Australian National Universities from 1999 to 2008, and Director of Women's Studies at Monash Universities from 1992 to 1995. She has directed action research projects with communities interested in alternative economic development pathways in Australia, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and the Philippines. These experiences have contributed to elaboration of a distinctive community partnering approach to local development, opens a new window. In 2008, she made a 50-minute film on social enterprise development as a local development strategist in the Philippines. Her most recent book, credited with Gerda Relnick and Kevin St. Martins, is entitled Making Other World Possible, Performing Diverse Economies. In 2013, she published Take Back the Economy, an ethical guide for transforming communities, co-authored with Jenny Cameron and Stephen Healy for University of Minnesota Press. It is my pleasure to have Katherine here with us today, also because together with my dear friend Antonella Clevitiello, we have just finalized the first Italian translation of Gibson Graham's work. It is a collection of texts aimed at giving the reader an overview of some of the main concepts and contributions made by Gibson Graham between the 90s and the 2000s. It includes the first paper published as Gibson Graham in Thinking Marxism in 1993, the 1994 milestone paper in Gender, Place and Culture on the Transformative Politics of Feminist Research, one of the chapters of The End of Capitalism, several chapters from a post-capitalist politics, and the 2010 paper published in Gender, Place and Culture on a feminist project for the Anthropocene. Why translate Gibson Graham's work today, and why inviting Katherine to give us a lecture and hold a course for our PhD students today? First of all, I think we need, possibly more than ever, the anti-essentialist project centered around subject transformation that Gibson Graham has been championing for decades. We live in challenging times where essentialist raw narratives are deployed in public discourse, but also in some academic and activist circles to exclude and discriminate people. Second, I think we need inspiration to engage with creative, out-of-the-box intellectual endeavors that challenge the status quo and intellectual normativities. I guess it is safe to say that in the history of our discipline, economic geography, few scholars have achieved so more than Gibson Graham. Before them, very few economic geographers, if any, were familiar with intellectuals like Butler or Sidgwick, and were willing to experiment by combining work inscribed in different epistemological traditions. While such efforts are now more widespread, I think it is important to understand where they come from, how they originated, the backlash they provoked. Moreover, as someone who has been deeply influenced by feminist thought, I think it is still of pivotal importance to acknowledge and highlight women's contribution to the discipline. Sadly, I feel like there is still the tendency to prioritize men work, citation, and contribution, and this being possibly particularly the case in Italy, both in academia and activist circles, where feminist scholarship is often contested and sidelined. Third and last, I want to highlight Gibson Graham's compelling call to question our own subject position as academics, knowledge producers, and in everything else we engage with in our everyday lives, in order to acknowledge that every one of us here today, everywhere, at any time, has the possibility to contribute to social change towards more just and equitable futures. I don't want to take more time, so we'll need now leave the floor to Katherine for a lecture titled Post-Capitalist Community Economies Here and Now, Sowing the Seeds of Transformative Futures. Katherine will talk for about an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion and debate. So thanks, everyone, and thanks, Katherine.
Well, thank you so much, Cesare. Is this working okay, the microphone? Yep, great. It's wonderful to be here and wonderful to be in a geography-oriented building and crowd. I'm just wondering, if I were to ask you who would identify as geographers, put up your hands. How many of you? Oh, that's nice to know. Thank you. It's so nice to be in a crowd of geographers, and you'll see why in a minute, probably. Okay, well, let me start by placing myself, which is, I think, a very geographical way to begin. I am now living in Canberra, which you can see up there on the top little map, some distance from Sydney, but I've only recently moved there. That's the salvias in my garden. This is our national capital in Australia, built on the lands, the unceded territory of the Kamberi people. This is the Indigenous tribes who have looked after this country for thousands of years. And in Australia these days, it's customary to place yourself and recognise and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which you're situated. And so I'm doing that here, but I'm new to this area. So it's a high country, luckily away from all the floods that have just happened in New South Wales. But originally, I actually grew up in Sydney, and this is the map of the Indigenous peoples of the Sydney Basin. And I grew up in this beautiful environment down on Gunnamatta Bay on this park, which was called Darook Park. And for all my childhood and until I really came back to the University of Western Sydney in 2009, I hadn't realised this was a kind of bastardised version of the Darug people, who are one of the groups that looked after this territory, again, for thousands of years. There were Aboriginal carvings nearby that I walked around thinking that Aboriginal people had long gone from the Sydney Basin. And it wasn't until I moved back to Western Sydney and read a wonderful book called Rivers and Resilience that talked about the resistance and living of Indigenous people throughout the last 200 years in Sydney, that I had to start to rethink my role as a member of the settler colonial population in this country, and the way in which our presence has obliterated in so many ways the previous owners. So that has taken me to think about the ways in which my own family have benefited and privileged from the extraction and appropriation of land. One of my great-grandfathers came as a convict from Australia and worked on a property out on the Nepean River, this big property, and got his ticket of leave, as they called it, after a few years, became a free settler. And within one generation, his son became a merchant capitalist, and then his son, my grandfather, became an Anglican minister. So within 3 generations, really, someone moved from abject poverty in London to a very middle-class existence, which then allowed my family to, go to university, have all sorts of privileges. On the other side of the family, on the Gibson side, the family came from Scotland and set up one of the first sugar plantations in Queensland, employing indentured labour from the South Sea Islands. And here's a picture of the people on the Binga property where my grandfather grew up. Again, appropriated land from Indigenous people, and indentured, almost slave labour being used to generate wealth, which most of the people apparently drank away, but my grandfather luckily escaped and studied medicine. But it just is interesting to think how quickly in a settler society people can move their positions, their status and wealth, and not realise it's at the expense of the loss of culture, the loss of lives. In the case of Indigenous people in Sydney, infection and so on took out so many thousands of people. And it's only now that Australia is, I think, starting to reckon with that history a little more, even though quite recently we had a referendum around giving Indigenous people a voice, and unfortunately it was lost. 60% of Australians voted against this, 40% for it, and this has been a very shameful thing that is really needing a lot of discussion at the moment. Luckily, where I'm living in Canberra, they were 60% the other way, so I've found my people. Anyway, that is just a little background to where I come from, and so it's very interesting for me to come to Europe and be involved in another very different, the other end of colonialism to some extent, where practices are quite different. So at the moment, I'm visiting Leuphana University in northern Germany, just south of Hamburg, which has been a centre of salt mining. There's an industrial geographer for you, since the 1300s. But interestingly, when I got there and as I travelled from Frankfurt and looked at the landscape around me, what I started thinking about was, of course, central place theory. For those of you who ever studied location theory and geography, you'll remember this model. And interestingly, look at Leuphana's image. They have a hexagon. I don't know that they know quite the connection, or whether there's a connection between that hexagon and that sort of model of settlement patterns that Christalla and then Lersch sort of instituted and universalized, and then used in the case of Christalla as a kind of settlement pattern that the Nazis then imposed on lands around Germany as they tried to move people into villages and displace others that didn't seem suitable and so on. And I guess that brings me to the point that geography has always been associated with geopolitical power, and it's played a major role in exercising that power. And in this case, it's also been a form of exercising of market relations, because this is a model of location totally built on how far you want to travel to get a diamond ring or a refrigerator. So it's all about commodification. It's about market relations. And Trevor Barnes has written a wonderful chapter in a book edited by Italians, Claudio Minca and Paolo Giaccaria, is it?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, talking about the interesting way in which these two location theorists, one was very enrolled in the Nazi project, and the other kind of operated under the radar and refused to become part of that. Very interesting. But, you know, being in this part of Germany really made me think about how a particular model in one place then gets universalized and has been used, you know, all the 20th century really to locate supermarkets, retail areas, etc., and create a capitalist landscape to some extent. And it's this kind of geography and then the quantification of space that it gave rise to, that's been the kind of geography I've worked against in my life and my career of over 50 years. And what I want to do today is talk about, I guess, the trajectory of my research, but particularly since rejecting a certain kind of Marxian analysis and critique of the capitalist world, with the introduction of the Diverse Economies Research Project, which is something that's now about 30 to 40 years old, 30 years old. So what I'm going to do in the lecture is really give you a sense of the trajectory of that research project, how we've tried to imagine and enact post-capitalist community economies against the mainstream vision of what the world is and how it's structured. And then towards the end, talk about some of the details around metrologies and recommening, particularly in relation to thinking about post-capitalist food futures. So I hope that's going to be not too long. Okay, so, and for those of you who are doing the course, this is probably a good way to situate some of the readings that you've been doing over the week. So the trajectory of this work really, I guess, began to some extent in a public sense with the publication of The End of Capitalism as We Knew It, which Cesare mentioned. Some of the chapters have been translated in this wonderful new book. And you can see there partly the image trying to convey what we were doing. There's Sisyphus rolling the hill, the big stone up the hill, only to have the big stone roll back down against him and come back again. And he just continually does it. And I guess our argument was that a lot of what was going on in economic geography was this trying to critique something, but really just making it more real to some extent. This book was then republished 10 years later with a new introduction. And it was also republished in Turkish a bit later. And I kind of like the Turkish cover much more because it has Julie and I as the kind of Daniels pitching our slingshots into the capitalist machine that's eating up people and eating up the earth. So I think it kind of captures it better than Sisyphus. I think it's some environmental poster that was co-opted. Anyway, you know, some of you might be intrigued by the fact that the authorship is a joint name of Julie Graham and Katherine Gibson. We decided to become one person as an author in 1992, and it was under the influence to some extent of feminism and postmodernism, where the playfulness of who is the author was a big discussion at the time. And so we thought, well, why don't we just put our names together? And of course, what it did was, in the long tradition of women writers, it denuded or neutered ourselves. We were no longer two women writing, we were this persona. And just as, you know, George Eliot took on a man's name to write her books, and there was also two Australian authors that I think underneath it all were influencing me, historical writers, Marjorie Barnard and Flora Eldershaw, who wrote under the name M. Barnard Eldershaw. And I think as a schoolgirl, I remember reading this work of theirs and thinking, oh, that's strange. So anyway, maybe it came back somehow when we decided to take on this name, kind of thinking about John Kenneth Galbraith. It sort of had that ring. This was long before J.K. Rowland was on the scene, so we didn't have that kind of reference, probably just as well. Anyway, we had a lot of fun with this name, and we got invited to all sorts of places where people thought we were one man. Little did they know we were two women, one in Australia and one in the US. Anyway, it's been an interesting journey, and unfortunately, Julie died in 2010. But whenever I'm writing something that I feel like is part of that opus of work that we developed together, I still publish under the joint name. So that book, those books were, 1996, and then the reissue of it, the Turkish translation. And in that book, we said that we were embarking or opening up the possibility of embarking on a project that had a discernible logic and momentum. And that project was to produce economic knowledge by developing a discourse of economic difference. Developing an economic imaginary populated with friendly monsters, I think we talked about those yesterday, of the non-capitalist sort, is itself a project, only minimally engaged in this book, but underway in other locations, that's had the potential to create new political subjects and desires. So that was our need to kind of really deconstruct this idea of capitalism, come up with the notion of difference and the notion of different kinds of subjects. So that was many years ago, and in 2020, we published, Kelly Dombowski and I as editors, the Handbook of Diverse Economies, which I think is a culmination, or it's not the end point, but it was an interesting kind of slice into what had proliferated over those 25 years. The book has 66 authors, 58 chapters. Here are some of the people holding up their copies. And it is a reflection of work done by people in the Community Economies Research Network that is spread now all around the world, and to which we're always inviting new people to join who are interested. So in 2006, when the other book was republished, we also put out a book where we'd start to thought about the politics of our work. And we introduced the idea of three kinds of politics. One, a politics of language, one, a politics of the subject, and the other, a politics of collective action. And often we associate politics largely with that last one, collective action, getting out on the streets with our slogans and trying to agitate for things. But what we argued in this book was how important it was to think about at least these three aspects and three projects that needed to come together to think about exciting desire for a different kind of economy. So our objective was to imagine, but not just imagine, which is what I think academics stay too often in that realm of discourse, but actually to enact post-capitalist community economies. And going on from there, I think some of our members in the Community Economies Institute, students of ours who've gone on to work in all sorts of fields, someone like Ethan Miller has also helped us to start to rethink that language of community economies and shift to a language of livelihoods, which might be in some ways a better way of dislodging the notion of economy. But I can come back to that in a while. So as Cesaro mentioned, in 2013, we moved away from writing more academic pieces to a book that was very much written to appeal to a generalist audience called Take Back the Economy, an ethical guide for transforming our communities. And this was really an attempt to try and make our work much more accessible to community members. And here's some of the copies of the covers of those translations of the book. And some of the translations, like this Finnish one, the translators have not only translated what's there, but added to it examples of community economy activism in Finland. And there's I think there's some other ones in the pipeline. I can't quite remember, but that book is easily accessible and is being used by communities all over the place, which sometimes we don't even know about it. But it is an attempt to try and encapsulate what are the practices of community economies, which I'll go on to in a second. So in the years since 1996, which is, how many years ago is that? long time ago. We have kind of spawned a community of scholars and activists, and also set up our own non-university education and research organisation called the Community Economies Institute, and Nuero, and of course this larger research network. So it is quite gratifying to see the way in which the work has been picked up and used. So that's kind of the trajectory. Let me come now to some of the core ideas that we were working with and still work with. And I guess the main one is a notion that there's something standing in the way of thinking and acting differently when it comes to economy. And it's this notion of the economy as a machine somehow that produces the limits to what we can do, is the bottom line against which nothing else can happen, and so on. And to some extent, there's a sense in which certain people have the levers of this machine, whether it's state policy or governments or the financial sector or whatever. But there's always a sense in which this thing stands outside of discourse to some extent. It's the ultimate real. And even though we've moved into a vision of reality as something that is constructed, there's something that's always outside it, and that's the economy somehow. So this was something that we were quite critical of, the way in which economy was conflated with capitalism, where these characteristics or these practices of waged labour, the production of commodities, production for markets, production for private property, technological innovation, inventiveness, entrepreneurialism, all these things are folded into a vision of a particular kind of economy. And going along with that, then, is this idea that there's, that capitalism has encompassing power, it has generalizable dynamics, and its agency is always expanding into every field. And yesterday we heard a great example of the expansion into the renewable field, and and against this, communities must cower in response. In that vision, the only available sort of economic subject positions are these very basic as employee, with particular desires and motivations. The employee always wants higher wages. There's the business owner who wants to make more profit. There's the consumer who's always looking for cheaper goods. There's the property owner who wants to make capital gains. There's the investor who wants more private returns. And there's the unemployed who has to get a job. So, when you ask people, what's your role in the economy? If you don't have one of those, then you feel like you don't have a role. So this is the kind of rational economic subject that still is lying behind a lot of the images of how economies work and how investors think about economies and so on. So there's no movement, there's no kind of sense in which we could start to entertain the idea of a decentered subject where there's other economic subject positions that we all know about and that we all occupy as parents or carers, as volunteers, as artists, as cooperators, as self-employed, as social entrepreneurs. And there are different motivations that go along with those subject positions. And to some extent, many of us occupy multiple subject positions in the economy. And there's a sort of ways in which that coexistence is written out of the story when one only focuses on those ones on the left-hand side. So we were asking ourselves and our readers, is it a capitalist economy or is it a diverse economy? And it's that figure ground shift kind of issue. Is it two faces or is it a vase? You can see one thing or you can see the other. And we were interested in unleashing a discourse of economic difference, a vision of a diverse economy, to see whether that would help develop a different kind of politics. So the image of the iceberg has been a useful one for all of the action research we've done, where we're talking to people in the community about how do you see yourself? Do you see yourself being an actor in an economy? Do you see yourself influencing where this region or this place or this town is going or not? And then asking, well, what is your contribution? What do you actually do? And finding out that so many people are doing things that are under the waterline to some extent. They're not necessarily involved or only involved in waged labour and commodity markets and in capitalist enterprises. So the image of the iceberg is a really interesting one to kind of open up people's perceptions of the multiplicity of roles that they might play. And it's lovely to see the book. I love the way this book has actually inverted it. So it's got the tip of the iceberg down the bottom instead of at the top. So part of this work is to kind of develop this different politics, a different language politics around the economy, then opening up the idea of different kinds of subjects and collective action. So reframing is an important strategy, and I'll go on to talk a little bit about that in a second. The idea of resubjectivation or resubjectification, sometimes it's called, but the idea of shifting subject position, or at least starting to occupy a different subject position. And then for us, collective action has largely focused on a form of action research, not that there's lots of other kinds of collective actions as well. And the image of the iceberg has travelled in all sorts of directions and taken on different formats. In this work I've done with others in the Pacific, an iceberg seemed to be a pretty irrelevant metaphor. So we talked about, we came up with the floating coconut, which made sense to the people a lot more. So here, you know, and for many people in the Pacific Islands, they were being told they have to get into the formal market if they want to get ahead. But really, when you looked at what most people were doing, very few people were involved in formal economic activities. Most people's livelihoods were coming from what economists would have called informal economic activities and non-cash economic activities, all sorts of transactions and so on. So here's an attempt to try and, with people, map out all the different things they were doing, just asking, even in the last 24 hours, what were the activities that you were involved in, and showing what they were doing and that they were making a contribution to livelihoods, but only those top ones were being recognised or supported by development policies and so on. So it's taken on different forms. In this case, this is a research project by an artist in Glasgow, and she hangs around in fish and chip shops and occupies the iceberg and asks people to come and fill in what they're doing. And there she is peering out and getting them to talk about the economy and what role they play in it and so on. So it's taken on all sorts of lives in its own. So these core ideas of a politics of language, the need to reframe, to represent, you know, take discourse in different directions, the idea of the centrality of the subject to thinking about something different, and then different kinds of action research have been influenced by a whole range of theoretical traditions listed there, and some of them, you know, more theoretical than others, and others much more practically oriented. And more recently, our research has become much more involved with what people are calling the more than human, thinking about relations with the earth and earth others, but also looking to allies, other people, other communities who are thinking economy differently, particularly those in First Nations people working in Indigenous contexts, and also the huge body of work on decolonial thinking that is also allied with this kind of work of trying to think of other worlds and work in and create other worlds. So that's kind of the introduction to the Diverse Economies Research Project. I just want to move on now to how we've gone about imagining and enacting post-capitalist community economies. So the iceberg is a very kind of easy to use image, but it goes along with a whole set of inventories that are much more fleshed out. And so what we've been doing with the Diverse Economies framing in the original book, we just talked about class processes as a particular way of differentiating economies. But here we're trying to look at all the ways that people work and are remunerated, including work that isn't paid for, but also otherly paid. So, and our world is full of all these different kinds of labour. Similarly, with transactions, we're interested in all the other kinds of markets that operate with different kinds of ethical relationships and also extortionist relationships. This map out of a diverse economies is purely an inventory. It's not a judgment of what's good or bad. It's really just an attempt to think about all the different things that are there that don't come under the umbrella of that kind of very refined vision of waged labor and market relations, and all the non-market transactions that are important to making lives. In the idea with enterprise, we're looking at not only capitalist firms, and one could start to differentiate that capitalist box as well and try and look at a whole range of different kinds of enterprises there, which I think a lot of economic geographers have already done. But we can talk about what we call more than capitalist firms, where there's other ethical practices and commitments that are attached to enterprise, for instance, in family businesses or state-owned businesses and not-for-profits and so on. And then all the range of non-capitalist enterprises, particularly in the co-op sector, the social economy with social enterprise and community enterprise and so on. And of course, the ever-present and still present role that slave enterprise and feudal enterprise still plays in certain contexts. And in the handbook, in the period of that development of that project, we developed an interest in trying to go beyond just labour, transactions and enterprise. Some of the early maps of the diverse economy only have those three areas, but we also then started to think about property and the ways in which the legal system interacts with property to establish different kinds of collectively owned property, and also, of course, open access to resources where there's often a struggle over enclosure or keeping things open. And lastly, finance, where there's a whole range of other forms of finance other than mainstream financial institutions, and also non-market ways of accessing funds. And there's been some very interesting research there on communities setting up their own financial institutions and lending groups and so on. So part of developing a language of diversity is to kind of do this kind of inventory work. And this is not an end point. It's something that's an ongoing thing, and it's an ongoing discussion as to how we would define these different practices. But what I guess takes us into the realm of community economies activism is to say, well, how do we take back the economy? How do we move away from thinking about work as all about making money, making more money, and markets about getting a good deal, and business about profit and so on? And so in Take Back the Economy, we tried to actually reframe what labour and work is really about. It's really about surviving well and surviving well. Like, how is it that we put together a portfolio of activities so that we actually have a nourishing life? How do we start to think about our relations with others through transactions that allow for us to encounter the other responsibly, whether the other is a person or an environment, a place at a distance, or the local farmer next door? How do we start to think about enterprise as a place that develops surplus and also distributes surplus? And how do we think about it distributing not just to the owners of capital, but to a wider community, to the workers, to other stakeholders around that enterprise? And when we think about property, we think about how do we actually come together to access and common what we need to live on and live with. And lastly, we've kind of reframing the idea of investment and finance as really why do we save? And it's largely to have a future, and to have a future for our children. So if we're thinking about investing in futures, what does that really mean? How could we build economies that allow us to invest in futures in ethical ways? So these are kind of what we call the sort of ethical coordinates or concerns that we feel are at the center of community economies, that we really need to be thinking about these elements if we're trying to build something different or identify within what we have at hand aspects of these kinds of practices. So we kind of identified community economy concerns where, yes, we're imagining politics of language and the subject, but we're also trying to enact and draw subjects into the idea of surviving well together and with the earth, distributing surplus, encountering others with ethical relations, commoning, investing in futures, and of course something that wasn't in those diagrams of consuming sustainably. So for us, post-capitalist possibilities lie with kind of enacting those practices and seeing those as the dynamics that we want to see made into logics, not the other dynamics that we associate with exploitative and extractive economic practices. Now, that's, of course, a big ask. And yet one of the tenets of our work is that we start where we are. We don't try and think of this as some kind of utopian other future that has to be built, that we actually can look around and see the elements of this already at hand. And our project is there to kind of help build assemblages that will enable those things to be strengthened and connected. And in that process, particularly in action research with people to do this, there is very much a need to attend to affect and emotion. And I'll come to that in a second, but and then part of that is then to develop alternative discourses that something like a community economy can exist, and then to adopt what I call an experimental orientation towards doing what we're doing, rather than that kind of judgmental relationship that says, oh, it's not going to work, or it's too small, or it's too this and it's too that. How do we actually try to engender a more experimental approach? But one of the first things I think one comes up against is one's own reaction and the reaction of others who feel like they just want a job. They want back what they had before. If they think about, in this case, it was a work in a deindustrialising region east of Melbourne where privatisation of the energy industry was meaning a lot of people were losing jobs, where they'd had very secure jobs in the state electricity industry for generations, and generations of men and their sons had got work in these brown coal mines and in the electricity generation industry. And suddenly that was all changing. And so, you know, there was a lot of anger in that community and resentment and fear and uncertainty, and to try and have a conversation with people about, well, actually people are the resource here, not the coal, was really difficult to try and shift that subjectivity to see people as having something of value. And one of the ways we tried to do this was to use artwork to get people to kind of put out there what they were feeling. And this was one of the group came up with this idea of Jock's story. And here we have the kind of ghost footprints of the worker walking across this landscape that now is full of shops that are selling, you know, like cheap money, and privatization is the boon for the industry. I was going to say pawn shops, but it's PAWN shops, not, anyway, it's too hard to explain. Shops where you take stuff in and get money back from it, and then you pay extortionate interest to get the money back. Yeah. Anyway, this was a reference to a very famous film and book written about the demise of coal mining in Wales called How Green Was My Valley. So they kind of took that term and used it. And the interesting thing was, once people had got this kind of anger and resentment out there, they felt they'd been heard, and then we could start to have conversations about, well, if we shift the dial a little bit and start to look at what else could be happening here, how might we think about other activities and economic practices that might be, you know, nourishing for people. And that project had a very interesting kind of impact. It started a whole lot of things, including some social enterprises and so on that people got involved in. And but it, you know, it didn't necessarily, some of them kept going for like 20 years and then others stopped, and for all sorts of various reasons. And Much more recently, there's been a huge environmental disaster in that region with one of the big coal mines, open-cut coal mines, catching fire, and they haven't been able to put the fire out, and the local town has just been inundated with toxic fumes. And there's been a resurgence of an interest in some kind of new vision for the valley. So these things don't happen overnight, but a lot of the people have harked back to this project as ways in which they could start to think about the valley differently. So part of attending to affect and emotion then is to how do you try and release the positive affect of hope and possibility through action. And in our action research, we've used lots of different strategies. And one of the first ones is this notion of inventory, trying to get people to actually look at their lives and inventory, what they're doing in their 24 hours, what kind of connections they have to get the goods that they need. To what extent do they get them from these very indirect connections versus direct connections and gift transactions? To what extent are they balancing time for life versus time for work? And to what extent are they inheriting privilege from the past, or have they been participating in all sorts of other forms of enclosure over the generations? So this idea of looking at a commons yardstick. And these are techniques that we are all documented in Take Back the Economy, because it's sort of like a how-to start to work together with people, doing inventory and collective reflection. And then I think the other aspect of this work has been to devise technologies that try and highlight ethical economic practices. And here we've used a whole range of things, not just language and images, but different algorithms and identities and metrics. And different people within the Community Economies Institute have used and developed all sorts of different metrics to try and have technologies that highlight ethical practices. For instance, Kevin St. Martin has worked on communities at sea, where he's worked with fishermen on the northeast coast of the US who are fighting against sort of industrial fishing. And he got them to actually do GIS mapping of the ways in which they access different sea floors. And they realized that they actually worked as a community without realizing it, that they kind of accessed a commons at sea. And through that project of mapping that, they started to think about ways of improving their livelihoods by not just increasing their catch, but keeping more of their catch that was the non-traditional sort of fish that usually gets thrown out. And they also started then a community-supported fishing movement to try and get ally with people in different markets to buy a whole range of different fish. These communities were places where people no longer ate fish. It was too expensive. Anyway, there's lots of techniques that people have tried out that are part and parcel of moving from the language politics and to engage subjects in developing different ways of working together and with the materials at hand to try and develop new technologies, new dynamics that would be part of a post-capitalist economy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, how are we going time-wise? Okay, about this community economy's return on investment as a tool that we've developed and in one particular context. So I'm moving on now to this last section on reframing and visioning for transformative post-capitalist politics. I've kind of talked about the reframing. I'm going to talk a bit about the metrologies and commoning now, because I think measurement plays a big role in trying to shift our perception. And I think we can learn this from the work that feminists played in pushing for the measurement of women's labour in unpaid labour. And Marilyn Waring, a New Zealand economist and politician, was very important in pushing this idea in her book, If Women Counted, New Feminist Economics. And it has been taken up all around the world in terms of trying to document the role and contribution of not just women's labour, but unpaid household labour in economies. And she asked the question, why is it in national accounts this isn't isn't part of the picture. We'll measure destructive things, but we won't measure all the life-giving work that people are doing. And so, you know, there's been a shift to some extent. Obviously, we would like to see a lot more there. One of the tools that we've developed, and I think has been an interesting kind of way of thinking about communities coming together, has been around this notion of commoning, which is also a very kind of interesting and contested area, which we could come back to talk about. But we've kind of broken it down to think about what we call a commons identity kit, saying that there's commons all around us. How do we identify them? And what is our role in maintaining them? And so we broke it down to thinking about commons as being something that where access is shared and wide, where use is negotiated by a community, where there is benefit that's widely distributed to the community members and beyond, where there's care provided by community. Doesn't like that. Is that me too close? Is it finished? No. Should be okay? Okay. Where responsibility is assumed, and then the argument here is that this can happen with any form of ownership, that you could actually have private property that's commoned in some ways, state property that's commoned, or open access that can be commoned. So the idea, I think the nub of the idea is that a community creates a commons, and a commons is necessary for a community. So what is that community? What is a commoning community? And commons isn't something that's static. It's something that always has to be made and remade and revisited and so on. And so part of caring for commons is also to recognise the ways in which commons have been enclosed in the past, or are continually enclosed, and that care for commons needs to have that sort of longer intergenerational perspective. And this is something that we learn from Indigenous communities, where they talk about any action should be thought 7 generations hence. How do we think through what is impact going to be 7 generations in the future? But it helps us to say, well, what is it that we have benefited from in the past? Like I was trying to do at the beginning of the talk. How is it that a commons has been enclosed and has benefited certain people, and what does that mean now for a post-capitalist politics? So I want to talk a little bit about how we've used these metrics to think about food production, and how we've used the community economy return on investment to try and kind of map out what it might mean to develop a more commoned food system. One example of some doing interesting measuring is the work that Lucy Svoboda has done in part of her PhD at Wageningen University, where she actually took seriously the amount of food that's produced in gardens in the Czech population. And she went out and actually mapped and weighed and quantified how many people were involved in food gardening, how much food they were producing, how much per person, how much self-sufficiency they were getting in winter versus in summer, what they did with it, whether they preserved or stored, whether they gave it away or it was directly consumed. This is a very kind of neat piece of quantitative research that shows the incredible kind of contribution that non-commodified food production was making to the livelihoods of people in cities in this particular context. And of course, we know that there's a lot going on around community food production, community gardens, particularly in places like Detroit, where it's a food desert in so many ways, and yet urban agriculture has really proliferated in the last 20 or 30 years. This is just a map of the Detroit area community gardens and large-scale urban farming that's often run by different NGOs and so on. And here in the Detroit area, there's a kind of a food metrics report where they talk about the role that all these different activities are playing within food systems. But and we're interested in looking at not just production in commodified food production, but non-commodified food production, particularly in all these gardens. But interestingly, when they tried to do a kind of assessment of the economic impact of Detroit's food system, they really only looked at the commodified food sector, looking at its impact. And this was all to do with trying to, engender support at a policy level for the food sector in this particular city, which has, of course, suffered a lot of deindustrialization. So if we take a more community economy value conception, we'd want to expand that vision to look at all the inputs into the economy, commodified and non-commodified economic practices that contribute to well-being, including caring, volunteering, family and community work. And so the question becomes, what does it mean for thinking about transformation pathways for community economies? What are the strategies we might put in place to try and put those value conceptions onto the table? How do we transition to a more decommodified sphere of reproduction and maybe initiate more commoning for a post-capitalist future? And Tapo and a group of others in Finland have actually started to look at the ways in which community economy policies could be initiated in, obviously, the welfare state in Finland, very different from many other states around Europe, but it's still an interesting engagement with the policy environment to say, if we're interested in these kinds of trajectories, what is it that we need to see supported at the policy level? So lastly, I'll just come to this example of trying to produce some way of speaking back to policymakers and investors around the value of developing commons and food commons. And this is a piece that was published in a journal, a special issue on transformative geographies of community initiatives. And it was a way of trying out a technology that we had theorized and put forward in Take Back the Economy, called the Community Economy Return on Investment, which is a bit of a take on the social return on investment. So the site that we worked on was this agro-city that was developed as part of the R-Urban project by the architectural group in Paris, led by Doina Petrescu and Konstantin Petko. And here is a plot of land that the local council in Colombes, about 20 k's out from Paris, there's the mainstream, there's Paris in the distance, allowed to be developed by the local community into community gardens, an urban farm and an agro-cité, which was like a cultural centre for getting together, discussing things, producing a kitchen where people could run a little social enterprise and so on. And this agro-city was also associated in their vision with a recycling laboratory and an eco-hub, which was going to be social housing. So the initial vision that they were putting forward to get funding from the EU was to have these 3 hubs that would be connected: food, recycling and living. And they didn't ever get to the living part of the project for various reasons, but they certainly did get the garden got going with local residents, and the recycling hub got built on a road where half of the road was closed off, so they could use and they were kind of saying, this is a vision for the future when we're not using so many cars. There's all these roads that could be actually split in 2. We don't need those big wide roads. You could use that land and common it for other kinds of activities. So they were. And everything they built had to be demountable in a week. They're architects who are interested in recycling and in moving things around, and they knew that it was vulnerable. So they had to be able to not just build something, but build something that could be debuilt, unbuilt. And this went for a number of years in a very interesting way. But unfortunately, there was a change of government at the local level. And the local mayor's husband was a property developer who decided he wanted a car park. So after much struggle, the whole agro-city was collapsed and the recycling lab was collapsed and a car park was built. interestingly, the whole idea of our urban has been taken up and is now in multiple other locations in Paris and in London. So it's not like this was the end, but the idea and has been reestablished in other places. But in the process, a lot of information was collected through the process of doing this work. And so this was a great example for us to start to look at what happens when you invest in supporting survival for people in your community. You invest in making it easier to consume less because people were making their own food, that you invest in enterprises that support surviving well. There were a number of new enterprises that began around this project, a worm farm and people learning about worm farms, a small cafe that started, and people had sort of social enterprises built at that hub. What happens when you invest and distribute surplus to people and back to the planet, because this land was being made breathable again in all sorts of ways. It was made green again. How do we, if we invest in fair encounters and invest in expanding our commons, what value is created? Yeah. And so this idea of a community economy investment was to say, let's look at all the investments and then look at the returns in terms of well-being, the ecological footprint, the collectively controlled surplus, and the kind of ethical trade and expanded commons. And then let's look at what the return is. So because there'd been such great documentation, they were able to actually look at the revenue that individuals were able to generate and collectives were able to generate, the value of, we imputed the value of volunteer labour time and the value of increased individual earning capacity because people learnt a lot of skills. They also had a lot of interactions that really helped with issues around mental health and inclusion and so on. And then there was a lot of money that was saved through the kinds of work that was done in households, by the state and by the planet. And so we were able to realise that the big grant that came from the EU was 1.2 million euros. The actual value that was created was equivalent to 3.4 million. And so the return on investment, if you then divide it by the investment, was something like 180%. That this was a kind of an investment that looked pretty puny when you actually started to value it. And obviously we're using the master's tools to do that valuation, which is problematic, but it's a strategic kind of move to sort of put that into the agenda. We could say back to the policymakers, to the EU, look at this. And obviously it's been picked up. The Our Urban project's just won a big prize in the new European Bauhaus competition. So it's getting a lot of interest to do this kind of work. But interestingly, it was an attempt for us to try and do that metrics, use those metrics and try and help people see their lives in a different way. And part of that was to create a new commoning community around these sites where the access, use, benefit, care and responsibility was being shared, and the property was, for a while there, it was owned by them, and then, or at least had access, and then it was taken away. But that is an insight into being able to secure various kinds of legal rights to property to do this work. So trying to do this kind of measurement and working at that policy interface, I think, is one of the areas that community economies research is moving towards. Everyone asks us, what do we think of the state? And we always kind of say, well, the state is many things. It itself is quite diverse. And the issue is to figure out where are the openings to work with, and who with, and in what format, whether it's through regulations, through law, through policies, and so on. So calculating the value of the urban commons, I think, is something that could happen in lots of different places, to be pushing back and as a mirror back to governments, to people in politics and so on. Experimenting more with decommodifying food, land and housing, which is something that the foundational economy people have been arguing for too. Obviously, all this work is best if done by connecting people across difference, and that was partly what was happening in that Colombe community, quite a very racially differentiated group. It was a way of building connections between people. And perhaps there is a discussion to be had about a livable income guarantee, or tweaking the idea of basic incomes to more community-oriented activities where maybe there's a pooling of these kinds of funds to do this kind of work. So I think, just to finish, there's many ways in which the community economies work is also thinking with others who enact a non-capitalist ethos. And there's plenty of other interesting communities at hand to work with. And one of the areas that we've done some work with is communities in Asia who have their own language of community economies. And one of the pieces we've written with about 20 academics and activists from Asia is to try and document some of those practices and the language that's used to define things like this, the process of carrying houses and moving houses when you need to, this sort of reciprocal labor exchange practice that's part and parcel of society in the Philippines, for instance. So anyone interested in that could look up the keywords of community economies in Asia. And I think there's a lot to do around translation and translation in both directions here, where in so many parts of the world, local languages are being lost, and with that is being lost knowledge about community economy practices that are part and parcel and have been part of livelihoods for many years. So the danger of the Anglosphere is that we ignore this, and I think teaming up with linguists to do this kind of work is a really important kind of edge that could be taken on. Of course, there's a whole lot of work done in cooperative economics, the Ujamaa movement in Africa, where there's a whole set of thinking around doing economy differently and activating different kinds of ethics. And in particular, I draw your attention to Caroline Shanaz-Hussain's work, which has worked with diasporic Afro-American, African, Caribbean, and other women around the world who formed their own savings groups, very much separate from the microfinance world of the Grameen Bank, to do ways of building solidarity with each other in the communities they're living in. The Banker Ladies, there's also some videos that she's done. And the other area that is, I think, of great interest, and we're already working with particularly Maori scholars around the ways in which Maori economics activates very different ethical relationships and has a whole language around spirituality and balance that is very interesting, that we are engaged with, thinking to what extent do they find diverse economies helpful, and to what extent can we learn so much from the ways in which they enact these ethical principles. And in the most recent review of the handbook, Jessica Gordon-Nembard's written a wonderful, she's an African-American political economist, written a wonderful piece about joy and the role that joy should play in building community economies, which I think we know, but we don't emphasize. So again, back to affect and emotion and building connections. And I think I will end there. Thank you very much.
Perfectly timed, like. Amazing. Wow. Thank you so much, Katherine. And I guess we can open the floor to questions, comments. You already have one? Maybe, yeah. Do you wanna maybe send up and also say your name if you want?
Yes.
No, maybe, yeah, sorry. Maybe it's better to use the microphone because the wise people at home can't hear. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Sasa, okay. I'm a singer. I used to. First of all, thank you so much, Katherine, for being here. It's huge for us. In the department, I always refer to you and Julie Graham as my mothers, alongside with Don Haraway and Dorin Massey, so it's a huge opportunity for us. So thank you so much. Jokes aside, we live in a complex world in which that global, it's almost becoming heavier and more pervasive on our everyday lives. Every day, I think, with words, genocides going on, cardinal pop stuff going on. So this is becoming even more complex for us to understand it. My question is in a community economies framework, what's the relationship between communities, our communities and global? I come from a place in which people don't know what capitalism even mean, what the word even mean. And people don't know even who's in charge in the municipality. They are focused on the everyday life, everyday struggles in their communities, in their houses, in their squares, in their schools. What could be the relationship? How can we read the relationship between this global and this local, this community? Thank you.
That's an easy one.
Just a warm up.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I guess I think that any attempt to try and build some kind of community across difference, and whatever way you do that, is going to be useful for trying to think about other ways of being. And I think, there's so many ways that the connections that people used to have with each other, and particularly the environments where they might come across people who are different from themselves and learn to live with them, have diminished over time, and that schism has been played upon so much by different political factions and so on. So any intervention, I think, that helps to allow people to occupy a different kind of subject position, or a kind of a human subject position that builds connection with others and does something together, whatever it is, whether it's building another soccer, field in a town or whatever, is a hopeful way to go. And it is also part of an economic reality, I think. So any research, I think, that can initiate and engender those kinds of feelings and those discussions, I think is one way to go. So it's very much a place-based, localist kind of approach. Of course, there needs to be thinking about, well, what would support that? Like, what at a level of state or policy or local government might do that? And so it's not like that local needs to be just left by itself. I think there has to be this idea of an assemblage, I think, is a very useful one that's come out of science and technology studies. How do we actually have assemblages that allow for those kinds of connections and spaces to proliferate? And where do we resist the fact that they're being closed down? And I guess that's the only way I can think about how to deal with the big picture, because so much of the big picture is resting upon very separatist, divergent, and kind of still colonizing visions, of hierarchical visions of who's worth something and who's not worth something, and all that kind of stuff. So how do we open up those spaces more and try to build that connection? I think is, the problem is that one of the ways that people do it is through various political movements that use very centered identities as the way to build connection. And I think that's something to resist at every turn, So even if it's just to have that conversation with your neighbor that says something like, oh, those people are like X, and to break that down a little bit is a beginning, I think. But yeah, I think it's, I guess it's also to look to the places where that is happening and think about how are they doing that, learning from that, because it is going on. It's not like it's not, but I know it's very hard at the moment with everything going on around us to actually find that energy to do that kind of work. But it does have its own benefits from, I think, that human connection does produce some other kind of energy that allows you to keep going. So trying to find that place. And as a researcher, I think it's worth doing as well, because if you find yourself researching stuff that is just making you more and more depressed, it's sort of like, why? So the world doesn't tell us what to research. There's something that we've got some role here in choosing what we focus on and what we don't focus on, without saying, it's not like we can avoid the bad stuff at all, but there is some way of looking out, having a kind of an antenna that tries to find some glimmers of ethical practice that could be amplified and worked with. So that's probably my wimpy answer to you. Your big question.
Yeah. Next question, maybe we can collect both of them. Yeah, you want to come from? Yeah, you stop. Yes, both. Yeah, the man with the green. Yeah.
Good morning, and thank you, first of all, and thank you, Chester, for organizing this. I was wondering if you can tell us more about your relationship with Julie Graham also, because I think this could be very inspiring for us, most of us young scholars, trying to find our ways in this really messy institution that the Italian university especially is, and where a lot of boundaries are set in terms of discipline, in competing between each other, and find our space of authorship, no? So if you would like to tell a bit more about the story of your cooperation and your commoning of knowledge, maybe this could be very inspiring for me. Thank you.
May I also? Okay.
And then I'll answer too.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to first of all thank you for your very nice speech and interesting speech. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. Having worked for several years as an officer of the United Nations in countries, especially in African countries, I wonder whether, and I think that your proposal might be very effective, or quite effective, potentially at least, in countries of the global south, probably, where it is very clearly evident that, to say, so to say, the great victory of capitalism, at least so far, is to hammer into the minds of people, common people, workers, and the lower layers of society, that this, what I would call naturalization of capitalism, making them feel or being convinced that capitalism is natural. It's just a natural phenomenon, and there is no alternative to it. And probably the way to work in the direction that you have indicated might, I suppose, be quite, as I say, effective way to counter this very biased and, in my view, destructive, widespread opinion that the capitalist world has built up in the last few decades. And the second question, which is not completely unrelated to the first, is since you are even geographically much closer than we are to the present day Chinese experience of managing these problems, I wonder what your opinion is about this way, this approach to the problems that the present day Chinese, let's say, ruling class is trying to implement.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Shall we answer the next one? Yeah, is that okay?
Okay. Okay, great. Well, yeah. So, yeah, thanks for the questions. And to say more about the relationship with Julie, I also need to recognize that Wendy is here, who knew Julie quite well, Wendy Harcourt, wonderful colleague, who in fact got Julie and I into a whole project on women and the politics of place with Arturo Escobar, and got us really engaged with place and thinking. First we thought, place? What do we think about place? I don't know anything about place. And then suddenly we had to theorize place, and we realized actually it was really important because, you know, women are everywhere and they're in place, and actually their ubiquity is their strength. You know, so it became a very central part of our thinking, actually. So I have Wendy to thank for that. Yeah, I think we know, as I think I mentioned to you yesterday, we started working together as graduate students. So at that time, there was, I suppose, in that US graduate school environment, a very different kind of affect, I think, at that time in the late 70s, where people were forming reading groups all the time and trying to be more actively involved and breaking down the separation of universities from practice and so on. And so, you know, there definitely wasn't that same pressure that you have to get out in a certain time and that kind of thing. There was a freedom that allowed us to explore a lot, and which I very much have benefited from. But, you know, it's very much of its time, I think. And we at Clark University, there were 50 graduate students in geography. So you can imagine it was quite a team of people. And there were quite a lot of differences amongst us all, but there was a lot of discussion going on. And the fact that we were able to suggest to our professor that we write a joint paper in the second semester and get it through was quite amazing, really. So I think, you know, there was a lot of joy in that relationship in terms of a lot of laughter and fun. We also had quite complementary skills, I think. Julie was an excellent English major and writer, and I had much more experience as an empirical researcher, and I was trained as a geographer. She knew nothing about geography, but Clark was one of those geography schools where you could come in with an undergraduate degree, as long as it was from an elite university, they didn't care, and you could start doing a geography degree. So that was sort of fun. We had that kind of different background. And I suppose she was also quite an experimental. She'd been very involved in the second wave feminism and had kind of rejected family in lots of ways, and had constructed a group of, lived in a community that was actually of other families, but they for now, I don't know, maybe 60 years, they've eaten together one day a week, one night a week for that long, where they have this practice of RSVP. Someone brings the reserve, which could be dessert or entree, starch, vegetable, and protein. And every week you move on to the next one. So you always know what you have to bring. And this group of people who are now approaching their 80s have been eating together in this community for ever since I was a graduate school student. So I was inculcated into this. So there was very much a sense of trying to live differently, like they all built their own houses in land that was trying to be developed away from it was part of the watershed of the Quabbin Reservoir, and they didn't want it to become suburbia. So they kind of tried to help stop that. So it was there was a way in which she was living a form of communalism that I had never really seen before, that informed our thinking, I suppose, in so many ways. But we were also, I think because there was two of us, we were quite happy to put ourselves into new contexts and try and learn new things. So, I mean, neither of us knew much about Marxist econometrics, but we both sort of decided to take it up and learn matrix algebra and all this kind of stuff. And then later on, we got involved in feminist post-structuralism and reading a lot of philosophy that, again, we weren't necessarily trained in. So, but the fact of having a partner, an intellectual partner, gave us strength to take on things that I think I would never have taken on myself, because you do it together and you bumble around. I remember reading Anti-Oedipus or something, of Deleuze and Guattari, and we were just like, what? And then we would just start laughing, and it was like there's a way in which working together with someone emboldens you to be much braver, and then also when you write you can be much braver too. So, and also I think more playful, because we were pretty much interested in pulling down the old boys of the discipline. So there was all that kind of stuff. And then I think probably the longevity of the relationship was contributed to by the fact that I went back to Australia to work and live, and she stayed in the US, and that was a way of dealing with the intensity of the relationship, probably. I think if we'd actually been living in the same place, it might have been quite hard. But we also organised after a while, once we had enough funds and my children were big enough that I could leave them, we organised to be together 2 times a year, what we called our nunneries. And so I would go there in August and she'd come to Australia in December or January. And so we set aside very key times to work together and think and write. And then that kind of helped for the rest of the year to kind of generate the thoughts that needed to be developed. So I think giving ourselves, again, having someone else to validate that, giving yourself the time to do that work. I mean, I say to my other, colleagues and people like Kelly with 4 children, I said, you must have a writing retreat. You must get away from that family and give yourself the time to think. And I think she does do that now. So it's trying to give yourself the space to do the exploration that you need if you want to try and do something different. And I think having that partnership really was, at the time you don't realize what's going on. Later on, you kind of think it through, and I think that's what really helped. So Julie was a very adventurous person and gregarious in terms of relationships too. So I think she selected me. I was this 23-year-old Australian who I'd never heard of people making appointments to have coffees with each other. I went, what? Is that what you do over here? She said, I'd like to have coffee with you. And I went, oh, all right. So I met her at the cafe. And then we started talking together. So there was a bit of an older sister, younger sister thing going on for a while, which she didn't like to be told about. She didn't like the idea that older siblings had a certain way of being and younger siblings had another way of being. But anyway, it was too. So anyway, it was like a long friendship that, sadly ended. But I think I don't know how unique it is, how much you could also reproduce it, but I think other people have tried to do all sorts of interesting things with authorship. And one of the most interesting things that actually my daughter's also taken up, but was pioneered by other feminist geographers in Australia, is to work with Indigenous elders and country, and they publish as country as an author. So I think there's some very interesting ways in which authorship is being shifted around and being actually accepted now, questioning the notion of who is saying what and so on. And so, I would encourage you to, experiment with that. And I think geography is a very, well, I was going to say benign, but it's an accommodating discipline. It's not a discipline that has had its strict paradigms in the way that even anthropology or economics or history has. So there's always been a form of allowance for certain kinds of experimentation. I'm not sure about Italian geography, but certainly in Anglo-Australian and Anglo geography, there's been that openness to experimentation of various kinds. That's been, I think, one of the reasons why it gets so read outside of the discipline. I think it's one of the disciplines that gets read across other social sciences and humanities and is used as a kind of an input into thinking. And it's partly because it hasn't had that same strict paradigmatic orthodoxy. Yeah, which, you know, is all, and early on it was its inferiority complex that we didn't have that. But I think lately it's been more likely, and recently it's become its strength, you know. So it's worth capitalizing on that, I think, and using, you know, trying to push the experimentation more. Yeah. Right. Well, okay. Well, I think, thank you, Paolo, for your question. And yeah, I guess I'm not sure whether there's ways in which this thinking is more relevant in some contexts than others. I think everywhere in the world, a certain form of economy called, you know, capitalist economy has been naturalized, and it certainly is continually being done in the global south through the ways in which development agencies and others are implementing their programs, particularly they're making markets work for the poor and all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot to challenge, but there's also, I think, a lot to work with, because there's also so much experimentation with trying to do something differently. In those contexts, I'm less familiar with work in Africa, and I'd love to be more involved in the kinds of work that is going on in that vein. But certainly in Latin America, there's huge numbers of amount of work going on around forms of decolonial economies and rethinking and community economies and experimentation there that is that we have a lot to learn from. China is, yes, an interesting behemoth, but again, I'd err against, I mean, if we're using our reading for difference lens, I think one has to also do that within China. And I certainly am involved with other Chinese researchers. You know, there's been a translation of the end of the Take Back the Economy in Chinese, and they're using it in certain kinds of village contexts and other contexts. So there is definitely an interest in a non-modernist vision of livelihood that's very much in a minor voice. It's not recognised perhaps as much by the mainstream parties, but there are various, certainly agricultural professors that I know of that are trying to operate and develop a different way of thinking about the rural in China anyway, where something like community economies work is of an ecological farming and so on is playing some role. So it is, yeah, it is difficult to know where that'll lead, but I think my tendency is always to work against that dominant vision that it's all sewn up somehow. I feel like one needs to keep looking for the cracks, and the cracks are usually there, and it's identifying those people who seem to be working in those cracks that gives you some kind of sense of hope for where conversations might occur. And, you know, China is taking an interesting role at the moment internationally when everybody else is, yeah, the geopolitical situation is so dire. But, you know, we have a lot of Chinese scholars and students in Australia, and I think those people-to-people relationships are what sustains me in thinking about hopefulness. My connection with those students and other faculty members has always been, you know, to just be amazed at their energy and their their principles, really. So I think we have to break down that kind of global vision of countries as this or that and trying to see it much more at a people-to-people level. That would be my answer there. So we've got a few others. Thank you.
Thanks to Professor Gibson for his passionate speech. I have a couple of answers. The first is, don't you think that we may pay more attention to digital production, to digital community, in a world in which data made up the 60% of the entire production of commodities or goods? And
so can you just say that again? I missed a few of the key words in that sentence.
The key words is
to what, sorry?
To digital production, digital production of goods and digital communities, first of all.
Yeah.
You are talking about communities and resistance communities. Yeah. And then the other is, in a world in which we foresee the end of the welfare state and a deep crisis of liberalism, don't you think that we need a more radical political proposal than a reformist survival of communities, of resistant communities? And then, just for a note, I want to remember Mark Fisher book about capitalist realism. The thing about was talking the guy before me. We live in a world in which the capital is able to even make us imagine something different from capitalism itself. Thanks.
Okay, yeah.
Should I go ahead? Okay. So first of all, thank you. Again, it feels like a great privilege to be in the same room with two major feminist scholars, Katherine Gibson and Wendy Orkert. My question is sort of in the spirit of thinking with and foregrounding feminist knowledge production. And it is about the convergences and tensions between your approach and the heretic Marxism of feminist Marxists. You use images such as the iceberg, which reminded me of Maria Mies, of course, and also your work on commons and commoning overlaps in parts with the work of Silvia Federici and other feminist Marxist thinkers whose work is also very close to activist feminist movements, and also in a moment in which concepts such as social reproduction have been sort of rediscovered over the past few years. So I was wondering whether you could talk about the convergences, but also the tensions, because I also think that there are some tensions there between. So perhaps might have something to do with the relationship with the state and policy, perhaps, but I would have to think more about it. Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, let's take one more.
So thank you very much for the inspiring talks. Your work has been very influential, I guess, for many of us in the room. So I have two questions. The first one, so you showed a slide where you had these capitalist economies or diverse economies, right? Yeah. So my question would be, why do we have to pose the question in a binary form, right? And while it's, in a sense, my question follows a little bit the last intervention. So is maybe political economy still useful to understand the kind of the world we live in, and therefore enable alternatives to succeed, right? And then the second question is maybe related to the idea of community and the collective subject. So you talked about community, but community itself can be a contested term, right? It's often co-opted, appropriated by many different people. Slogans such as "take back the economy" recently have been used by people I do not kind of feel very close with. So the question would be, how can we build a community that does not reproduce uneven power dynamics? So who are the subject within the community? Of course, like a global renowned established scholars like you is not the same voice of an early career researcher or a PhD student. So how can we prevent, right, for community to be, or how can we build better communities? Thank you.
Okay. Great, thank you. Yes, well, first of all, thank you for your questions. The digital production and digital communities, I must say it's an area that I have not worked on at all. Partly why? My age, I think. And I know there's a lot of people working on these things. And there's a lot of, like in my Institute for Culture and Society, there's a wonderful group of people working with young people on digital communities and their construction and so on. So I haven't had the, I don't know, I haven't had the experience, and I haven't had the time, or I haven't worked on this at all. I think it's obviously a huge area of work and to be done. And in terms of, the ways in which the digital is being used and manipulated in certain ways to break down relationships, or to foster certain kinds of relationships that have devastating impacts, particularly on young people. I think there's a huge amount of work to be done, but there's also, I think, interesting, obviously, we can't get rid of this thing. There's obviously a lot of ways in which there's new ways of using the digital to try and construct more livable and ethical kind of relationships. And I'm kind of interested to see a next generation of scholars trying to take community economies in that direction and looking at it. But really, I have very little to say about it other than that it's a very important issue. Yeah, I mean, the end of the welfare state, I'm not sure whether whether it's too early to say that. I mean, obviously there's lots of aspects of the welfare state that have broken down, and perhaps maybe always should have, the top-down patriarchal kind of we know best for you kind of aspect of it. But, I just come from a country that's voted in a mainstream and leftist kind of Labour Party that still is very much, and one of the main planks of its support was support for a national health policy and health care situation, for support for disability insurance and disability carers, and lots of aspects of care and welfare that are central to, that have been central to Australia's, I suppose, state of being and so on. So it's the end is, I don't know that we, in various contexts there's been a huge attack on these kinds of things, and in other places less so. So I think I guess my sense is, for those people who think that a more radical solution is going to have some sway, all power to them. But I kind of don't see that happening in many of the contexts that I am involved in. So I guess I'm much more of a, let's just work with what we have and try and push things in a certain direction, rather than try and pose something that's totally different. I mean, even in Australia, the Greens Party, which has had a lot of power in the past, started to push a much more radical agenda, and they lost a lot of people's votes. So how you move people as a population towards more progressive situations isn't necessarily going to come through the more radical you are. So I wonder about that. But politics isn't, that sort of politics isn't my forte. I'm interested in, I think, things that are much more on the ground and more place-based. And one of the interesting things that's happened in Australia is the growth of what they call the teals, and they're professional women who have launched campaigns that are very much about community participation around kitchen table conversations. They've used very much a kind of let's work at the community level to discuss things with people. And in very conservative seats, they've managed to get into power and oust very conservative politicians. So I think there's some techniques that they've used that are very much part and parcel of what a community economies approach would be in terms of speaking to people and moving people. And they've now, they've got quite a voice in Parliament as a kind of a block of people who, they're are able to hold. They're very concerned about transparency and about climate change issues. They're two big issues, and both of them are ones that they've managed to get a lot of support for. So, yeah, I guess I'm maybe some people would call that all reformist. I don't know, but that's kind of yeah, where I'm going. Capitalist realism. Well, I mean, I'm always critical of a kind of realist perspective because of its kind of you know, its confidence that it can touch the world somehow better than other people. So I feel like the post-structuralist feminist in me is always one that's going to say, actually, we have frames of thinking about things, and they also create realities. So yeah, I shy away from that kind of thinking because I don't find it that helpful. I find it always building barriers to me doing anything. So yeah. To come on to the tensions, and yeah, I mean, I'm interested to know what they are. I certainly acknowledge, you know, so many feminist thinkers whose work has contributed to our work, and images, for instance, like Maria Meyer's use of the iceberg and other ways that kind of has contributed to our thinking. And I guess yes, I haven't done enough more detailed reading of their work most recently to be able to articulate what the tensions might be. I think there's a lot of convergence, and I think maybe there's tensions around strategy, and perhaps those strategies are really tied into the context that people are involved in too. So I'm wary of trying to overdo the tensions, because I think so much of what we do and what we advocate and what we see as possible is tied into the particular social formation that we've come from and that we're part of. So understanding that background and why you might be so wary of state policy in some contexts and not in others, I think would require a bit more work to be done. And it could be interesting to try and do that. Yeah, but thank you for that question. Yeah, that framing of the binary, that vision was really just a tactic, a strategy to say, you know, let's look at the way we think. What is it we see and what we don't see? I don't think it was trying to establish a binary between two economies. And in fact, in a way, you know, I think this is partly why we're trying to abandon the term economy to some extent and move to livelihoods, because of the way in which it kind of automatically imposes a sense of kind of coherence, as if there's something called the capitalist economy and then the diverse economy, as if it has dynamics in the same kind of logics in the same kind of way. So I think that figure ground shift image is purely something to get people to kind of like force them to start to think about what we see. Another image that's been used by others is to say, well, let's look at the starry sky at night, and why is it that we pick out Orion's belt and we pick out, you know, the Southern Cross or the North Pole Star or whatever, whereas we could look at all that array of the Milky Way, and yet we're trained to kind of come in and focus in on these kinds of ones. So it's just trying to get people to sort of think back to how they think. I think within a diverse economy, there are capitalist practices, or within that vision of diversity, which is trying to deconstruct the master term and say there's heterogeneity on both the capitalism and non-capitalist side of the binary. And in that context, if everything's broken down to practices, yes, there's capitalist practices and there's a whole array of diverse economic practices that we've inventorized. But what we've got then is this heterogeneous mess. And what we want to do with that to make a different economy is, how do we put those pieces together that we identify as actually enacting some kind of ethical responsibility to others and to communities and so on. So it's and some of those may well be good capitalist firms that are doing something interesting, like I talked a bit about a manufacturing project yesterday. The community issue is, of course, one that is always with us and always comes up. Community is a hugely freighted term. We all know it's a term that's been used by fascism. It's been used by socialism. It's a term that often is used to try and define sameness. Who are we? Who are we against? And that idea of community in terms of a sense of being is exactly the kind of sense of community that we're trying to work against by using Jean-Luc Nancy's notion of community as something that's always becoming, that's always in the process of being made. And it's those relationships of making that we need to be focusing on. What is it that that community is building and making? And to some extent, sometimes the exclusionary aspect of community has a liberating effect. And one could think of some examples of that, but in many cases, it mainly has that boundary making has a detrimental effect. So the kind of community that I guess we're interested in being involved in is what I would call a becoming community, a community that is always asking the questions about what negotiations are we making, who is benefiting from these, and putting that at the forefront of what it is to be together, to live together, to live alongside each other. You know, we're born into a sense of sociality and into a community, but we deny the fact that it plays a major role in our lives. We sort of, continually get individualized as graduate students, as researchers. What is the community of scholars that geographers would like to be part of? And what is the kind of geography we'd like to do that's not about maintenance of geopolitical boundaries? How is it we could work against being enrolled into mapping the border between Pakistan and India, as Oscar Spate did, or figuring out how to displace people on the plains of Poland so that there can be this nice locational pattern. As a community, we need to think through that, because as a community, we've been part and parcel of doing that kind of work. And it's hard to think of geographers as a community, but it's one place that we could start to work on that kind of thing. But we are a becoming community, and what is it that we're trying to become? I think there's a lot going on around that's of interest. And the term community is, it would be nice to have something that would be replacing it, that would be more signaling this other kind of openness, because it's almost like a nothingness until it's built. But that's the limits of language too, I think. And to some extent, you have to kind of face up to that responsibility that when you use those terms, they're going to be understood in lots of different ways. So you're going to have those more nuanced conversations around when you use the term community economies. But it's it's a great question. Thank you. That must be enough.
Yeah, should we? Interesting. We're going to go first, and we'll have a question from Paul.
That's the last two.
Yeah, we can do the last round. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay. The last round. Okay. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Almost 12:30.
Thank you very much.
Hi,
So I go
Sana.
straight to the question because we are a bit late, I think. So just to contextualize what I'm saying, we experienced a big hope in Europe at the beginning of around 2000, in the moment of the contestation of the global movement, the alter globalist movement, and then back after the crisis during the Occupy movement and the Indignados in Europe and the movement of commons. But what about, so we had a big hope for these communities, economies that were spreading around. But of course, right now, after pandemic and in this enduring moment of war exception, it's difficult. It's more difficult because we are coming back to a state. Of course, it's a different state. It's not the state of the 20th century, even not the state of the beginning of the 21st century, but we have this coming back to the state. I think that it's very useful. Your work is particularly useful, not only because it gives us a framework to identify, analyze communities' economy, but even because you give us tools to analyze long-term policies that were performed through assemblages of actors, public, private. For example, I always present to my students the common yardstick to understand long-term policies for the climate change. So my question is, how these communities, economies, and these kind of experiences through these different assemblages of actors can be prefigurative of a different state, even of a different welfare state, both claiming from the state, acting with the state, and try to re-articulating the state and the public at all these scales. Thank you.
Hello, I'm
Hi.
Oksana. Thank you so much for your talk, and I really appreciate your mentioning indigenous perspectives, indigenous economic theories. As I mentioned yesterday in the seminar, I'm studying how movements such as degrowth can learn from the indigenous takes on economic relationships. And what comes up in my thinking and reading, the question that pops up a lot is, how do we learn from the indigenous perspectives, but what does it look like in practice? Because I think we mention sometimes indigenous knowledges, indigenous perspectives as this little nice add-on to our theories, but what does it actually look in practice? Because engaging with the indigenous perspectives on their own terms is very difficult given the difference of the worldview. And what I see is that spirituality is this big barrier of understanding the indigenous perspectives on a profound level. It is difficult in the European context, and it seems to be also difficult in other contexts where indigenous communities are more present, including this example, the embarrassing results of the referendum that you mentioned in Australia. So do you have any examples of positive inclusion of indigenous perspectives into broader economic theories? Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Largely theoretical. How does the diverse economy framework relate to other alternative economic ideas concept? I'm thinking in particular when we live and post-growth. Are there interesting and generative potential for conversation with these frameworks? And second, what place does the gift and the gift economy have in a community diverse economy framework? It often appears in diversity economy tables and diagrams, but there aren't any textbooks, work you would suggest reading about this, about gift?
Right. Okay, thank you. Yes. Okay, prefiguring a different state. Yeah. I think one of the places I can see works going on here is one aspect of the state, which is law. So there's an interesting group of legal scholars who are part of the Community Economies Research Network, who are working on both some of the ways in which there are legal barriers to doing economy differently or running enterprises differently and so on. And but also thinking about the ways in which laws could be modified to, support commons ownership and other things like that. So I think there's now that might prefigure an aspect of the state. And I think that law as an infrastructure that has helped to, has maintained a certain kinds of economic structures, even though there's, a long history of cooperative law and new laws that have been used in the movement, even in Italy, for instance, around use of distributive cooperatives and so on. There's a lot there that can be drawn together. So I think it would be great to see a kind of book on community economies and law, for instance, that would document some of these practices that could be implemented and that could be introduced in different contexts. So I think we need to kind of break down the state, and we need to look at it in terms of its many different aspects. If it comes to courts, for instance, there is the whole movement towards different kinds of doing restorative justice and that kind of work that is about community building, bringing the community into the process of sentencing, for instance, that particularly is happening with Indigenous communities anyway. And that is about doing a different kind of law. Again, it's again reading for difference. Like, let's take different aspects of the state. When it comes to certain kinds of policy, I think local governments perhaps are most open potentially to relaxing some of their regulations that might allow for different kinds of economic enterprises to develop, or they're also interested in experimenting with things like a some kind of a basic livable income guarantee, for instance, to see whether that could be initiated at a local level. So again, I guess I would open up those, the empirical questions around where are these things happening and how could they come together? And, prefiguration sounds a little bit too kind of holistic. I like, it's a good term, but it's really, it takes a figure. Like, how do we build the figure? It's like the system. But if we start with the disparate pieces and try to build connections with them in an assemblage, it would be a matter of thinking about what are the different elements of an assemblage that might need to come together to support these kinds of non-commodified food production in a city, for instance. Let's try and take that as a thought experiment and look at all the laws and policies and et cetera that it might be standing in the way, and what might we be able to do with that kind of thing. So if we got people on board and presented to them the community economy return on investment and like what was actually happening there, maybe that would be a way of asking them to think about, well, let's try another experiment, and what would be the conditions under which this could work better? How might there be some kind of legal framework that gives the community a 10-year lease on that land at no cost? Like, actually make it as a thought experiment. And what I think people find is there's a lot of people within the policy realm who are very sympathetic to this kind of work and want to know how to do something differently, but just have no ideas. So I think the idea of running those kinds of conversations is one way forward. Yes, Indigenous perspectives. I think, yes, we have to be careful about how we discuss them. And where are you? Right at the back there, yeah. And also work with them. And I guess my most closest experience with that is still at a distance, and it's really happening in New Zealand, where there is an interesting number of Maori scholars who have learnt and trained on diverse economies and community economies, but they're also very involved in their own iwi and working on economic development for their own tribes and so on. And they are really at the forefront of trying to put these things together. And so I would look at some of the work of Maria Baj, who has a chapter in the handbook, and others who are coming up, Emma Lees and others in New Zealand, where there is so much more recognition. I mean, 20% or more of the population, and the younger generation, even much higher percentage of the population, are Maori or Pacifica people. And so the presence of, other ways of being, community relationships, support, and so on, is very present. And it's present in policy, even though at the moment there's a government that wants to undermine things. There's been a lot of backlash against that too. So I guess I would look for concrete examples of where that's going on. Ethan Miller's work, he's working on in a group called Land in Common that's largely led by First Nations Wabanaki people in Maine, and also immigrant communities, to try and get land back into the hands of Indigenous people to run their own farms and so on. And so there's a whole address to Maine people in the state of Maine, landholders, to try and work on that land back kind of movement. And again, they're kind of marrying Indigenous perspectives with kind of forms of, I guess, ecological farming and community economies kind of work. Yeah, I think it's hard again to make generalist comments around here, but again, I'd point you to particular examples. There's also Alison and Guzman, and there's a couple called the Maple Collective who are working in Lake Booty in Chile with Indigenous people using kind of community economies work, and also the whole cosmologies coming out of their own community around trying to build livelihoods in different ways that they're working on and actively working on. Probably don't have much time. I think actually Ignacio is going to start a PhD, so he's going to try and start writing some of that up. So I think there's examples, and yeah, I haven't got any more general comment about it to say, but it is very much about building the relationships first before you start to write about what's happening, or you know, there's the abstract sense that there's other cosmologies out there and there's other ways of thinking economy, but actually to start thinking about those connections, I think has to be done in relationship with people together, so that you can have joint authorship or no, you know, or step back from authorship and see whether they even want people to write up about it or not. There's a lot of, you know, interesting ethical practices there that I think need to be thought through. And, you know, in one of the, I guess, one of the gifts of being in a settler colonial environment is there is an opportunity to do that work, and much harder in Europe, although I guess it's happening a lot more in places like Norway and others, to do that kind of thinking. And the question around the relationship to other movements, yes, I think there is a lot of connection to the Buen Vivir movement, to the commoning movement. These are all allied and related kind of social economic movements that we are in conversation with in various ways, and look to for inspiration as well as connection. Gifting, I think, does turn up in the transactions, I would have thought. But again, I resist the idea of a gift economy. I see gifting as a practice or process that is part and parcel of many livelihoods. I think there was a whole study of this in France by, I can't remember who it was who did this work, but you know, the role that gifting plays in all of our lives, especially intergenerationally, I think is quite an interesting one. And yeah, we don't necessarily need to keep reifying Mouse's work on that, just to keep working on the gift, I think. But you know, the way in which the gift is kind of seen as part of a binary is one of those things I think that diverse economies would try and break down a bit, but see it as one of many processes and transactions, some of which are surrounded by very complex cultural performances, and others that are much more kind of everyday. So yeah, there's many ways in which this work is allied to lots of other projects and work, and it's great to see that happening, and to see what sort of politics comes out of that work too, and trying to define where we can work together is definitely a project. I think I might be done for.
Yeah, I think you've done more than enough. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for your contribution, and thank you so much, Katherine, for everything.
Okay, funny about the what happened with the